Hey guys, it's Daniel Faust. This is part two of our superhero Sanctum. If you guys watch us each and every week, the fifth week of our lives, we enter the superhero Sanctum, meeting with subject matter experts in the military, veteran, first responder world that are going over and thriving and bringing their wisdom to the table. So we have a guest, Heather Van Mill. Now, I've known her for about 14 years. And she was Air Force for about 4 to 6 years and spent about 20 years in the crisis intervention world. So she's going to share her war story. We're going to go over some questions. And always remember, guys, this is a dialogue, not a monologue. So you guys can go throw out your questions, put your comments in there. We'll put them on the screen. We'll grill Heather until she goes over and explodes or she doesn't have an answer, and we'll go from there. So Heather, thank you for joining. And if you can go share your war hero story with us.
Okay, so I served 5.5 years in the Air Force, and for the most part, I was behind a desk, so it was pretty straightforward. It was during the Gulf War, but I was in California and Colorado. But what was I think that experience was fantastic. I don't absolutely have no regrets. I proudly served. And, at a certain point, I was ready to transition as a civilian veteran. And so that was, I would say, definitely, what do I want to say? It was life altering to make that transition. I had a lot of excitement, trepidation. I was questioning, like, is this the right decision to get out of the Air Force and go into something that I didn't know what was going to happen. I had a couple of plans and those kinds of things. So what happened is that I had not only served 5.5 years, but I also earned my 2-year associate's degree in social science. I also had my community college of the Air Force and Air Force Achievement Medal. So I had some accomplishments. And so I felt very, I had some confidence also going into the civilian sector. So I thought once I got out, that I was going to find that job. I was going to make some really decent money and I would be able to support my son and I, who was at the time a toddler. And when I got out, it was a reality shock, definitely a shocker. So when I got out, I found out it wasn't that easy,
No.
and so I started to, question, like, what did I do? I made a huge mistake. I started to really I lost some confidence, and it was definitely anxiety making for sure. Um, and so for 6 months, I was just going, what am I going to do? So I found out very quickly, like I tried to apply like at Enterprise Rental Car, and they said you have to have a 4-year degree to apply Enterprise. And I was coming across a lot of that. It's like, we appreciate your service, but we're looking for something else. And it was usually a 4-year degree plus experience, and I didn't have that. So, anyways, I started to quickly. So I was getting very anxious and started looking at, well, what else can I do? So I had found a job. I was making minimum wage. That's what I made before I went into the Air Force. And so I felt like I'm going backwards, not forwards. So then I thought about going into college and I put my application together. But before I put my application together, I started doing the numbers. I started crunching the numbers. Even with the GI Bill money, I was crunching those numbers and thinking, can I afford going to college? And the numbers kept coming back the same. They kept coming back that I would be in the negative and that there was no way I could afford going to college.
Yeah.
And so I looked at that and I looked at where I was at. And of course, I had a little boy. And I remember so vividly, I just took that piece of paper, crumbled it up, and I tossed it into the trash. I said, it's going to have to work. I'm going to have to go to college. So I applied, was accepted, started probably about 6 months after I got out of the Air Force, and just was very committed. So that was kind of a turning point for me. That was one of many stressful situations in my life. It was, in fact, what I would define as a crisis. Today,
Hmm.
I work with crime victim survivors. I've worked
Hmm.
with crime victim survivors for over about 24 years, both in the military, in the vet center, and also with the state of Washington. And so some of the tools that I learned along the way, both academically and life experience, I also have applied those same skill sets in working with survivors of crime. And so maybe it might help someone, maybe it doesn't, but at least there's some tools there.
Yeah, and that's huge. Like, especially what was it, the early '90s when you left the service?
Yes, yep.
So
So it was
yeah.
a while ago, but some of it's still the same. When people leave the service, there's excitement because it's like, oh, I'm going to start something new and different.
Hmm.
And then there's the anxiety. And so I think those feelings are still very much similar or the same. Um, so yeah.
So that's a great story. And let's go into our questions to go over and bring the wisdom out. So we are in a crisis right now as a nation. Some of the
Mhm.
states are reactivating. Your state's probably taking a while. We've heard some states it might take up to 2 years based on the studies coming
Mhm.
back. So, and as an expert dealing with crisis intervention and dealing with over 2 decades of experience, what is the definition of a crisis?
So I would say a crisis is something that is very stressful. It's something that creates an imbalance in your life. And that stress could be emotional, it could be psychological, it could be a traumatic event. So it's a very wide spectrum of a situation. And it's also pretty short term. A crisis isn't going to last forever, it does have a lifespan. So it feels like it's never going to end, but in fact, there is an end point. And I think that's always reassuring to people to know that this too will pass. Um, and so that sometimes can create some relief for people. But that's what I would say is a crisis. It's sometimes you may hear that a crisis is related to, like, there's a saying, like the Chinese characters. It says that crisis means danger and opportunity,
Hmm.
and I would say that's very I think that's pretty accurate. It can create some amazing opportunities, even though you might think it does not. And it's interesting how life can change for sure, for the better. So yeah.
I think that's good wisdom in that regard, calling it danger and opportunity. And the thing is that several people have probably, as the years gone by, we've gone through those crises and we kind of forget on what opportunity is open, but what the danger of it is. Because literally, we forget about 9/11 until that date. We forget about the economic crisis until we see it again. We forget about the flus and the sickness and whatnot and other things of that nature. So going into that, what events are considered a crisis? So what type of events would I or you or our audience go walk through would be considered a crisis? Is me breaking a hangnail a crisis, or is something extreme as a death? I mean, where is the boundary in that thing?
I would say it's how the person perceives it, that their system, their whole being is overwhelmed by something that's external. And so in my lifetime, I've had multiple crises. I mean, that was just one example that I provided in my own life experience.
Hmm.
But I've gone through two base closures. I've gone through two base realignments. I've gone through risk reduction, furloughs, um, and and again, I have a family to support, so I've gone through those financial crises, if you
Hmm.
will. And there's also traumatic ones. There's natural disasters, those kinds of things, and those can overwhelm a system as well, a person. But people can move on and move forward, and they do. And there's some great skill sets that may be helpful to get you through that crisis and move on and get stronger. It doesn't feel like it at the time. It feels like the sky is falling, and sometimes you don't want to hear stuff like that. Like, oh, I don't want to hear somebody trying to say it's how you look at the situation, but sometimes it is.
I think you said something very profound there is moving forward. I remember watching a TED talk about that. And her husband died and they said, oh, everybody said, you need to move on. You need to move on. I'm like, it's my husband. I built a legacy with this person. They went over and died of cancer. It's learning to move forward in those steps. I think that was very profound in what you go over and said. Now, going into that, who or what should our audience, yourself, turn to when we're in a crisis? So we realize it's like, hey, it's too much for our hands. It's overwhelming emotionally, relationally, transactionally, professionally, whatever it is. Who and what should I turn to when I'm in a crisis?
I think it's different for everybody, but one of the things that I think is really helpful is people, is having a support network. So sometimes you'll hear like informal resiliency, formal resiliency. And really what that means is like informal resiliency is you're turning to friends, family, um, coworkers, supervisors. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've turned to friends and they got me through some really tough times where you're just venting.
Mm,
Um, so I think having those relationships are so important, and you don't have to have 100 followers or 100 people to turn to. It could be just a couple of people.
mm,
If you're one of the folks watching this, and you're like, I don't have that, or I don't have anybody close to me that's in close proximity. Um, there are ways where you can reach out and virtually create a tribe, So I've done
mm,
that too, where it's like a lot of my friends were scattered across the US, and I was trying to find somebody in close proximity that I could relate to. And so I really accessed some of the different virtual options that are out there. So for me, at the time, I did Meetup,
mm.
found people that had like-minded interests, and that was fantastic. For other people, they might try Facebook. Of course, is huge right now during the COVID-19. Some folks go on to blah therapy. I've heard some good things about that. So everybody's a little bit different.
I think that was key in that. What you said specifically is that we can have, like, I have 4,900 friends, and I just looked at it just recently. And people don't realize, let's say the social media world, sometimes less is more in that particular regard because it's going to be more active in that regard. And especially you have to figure out where it works for you. Sometimes it might be someone that's exactly in proximity. They might be your next door neighbor or your coworker. Other times they not be able to empathize because sympathy is similar. You go over, I've been hit by a couple cars. I'm pretty sure you haven't as a pedestrian because we've had these conversations in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But someone, 100,000 miles from here could go over and say like, yeah, I was almost hit by a bus. I'm like, me too. And they can relate to that
Right.
specific scenario. So that's key, is that we need to balance and say, okay, less is more for one regard. And then also, it might not always be that BFF that's next door. It might be that BFF that's online.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say friends, family, coworkers, supervisors. I mean, there's they might be watching now that were supervisors that made a huge impact on my life. I mean, there's so
Mm-hmm.
many people that made a positive impact on my life. Um, the other thing I would say is formal resiliency, formal agencies to turn to.
Mm-hmm.
So every now and again, that can be really nice. So when I was going to college, I actually went to see a counselor on campus. And for
Mm-hmm.
me, that was that's what I needed at that particular time. And it was very helpful. And there is no shame in reaching out and asking for help. And from a mental health provider, I think I think that it shows a great deal of strength and courage, and to say, I need help. And I definitely needed that at that time. And so that's a formal resiliency resource is counselors. I also went to church. I went every Sunday and volunteered and gave back to the community, and it felt good, and it
Hmm.
was something that I was very passionate about. And so, so if that speaks to you, try it out. If it doesn't, if you're more, maybe you're a little bit shy about organized religion, maybe for you it's whatever higher power, um, try that out. Try volunteering. Sometimes that can be nice too.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest things is that we have that shame and we hold on to that. And that's
Mhm.
an internal thing. And the person that we're going to or the resource we're going to doesn't hold that shame. They're not like, oh, you feel shame and I shall give it to you. And I'm going to
Yeah.
deliver it. And that's, I think we need to get that out of our head is that guilt is one thing and shame is another. Shame goes over and destroys. Guilt realizes you're doing something wrong. Like, hey, I stole at the bank. I should feel guilty. But I don't need to be shamed if I did it 27 years ago and I gave back $1 billion. I don't need to go over and do that. Or, hey, I went through this crisis, one similar one 3 years ago, because I've been almost homeless 3 times. And for me, I'm like, at first you do, it's just like, you do all this work and everything else. And you're like, I feel shame. But now I'm like, I did everything in my power to do. They could go over and think what they want, and I'm just going to go in there. But that's just
Mhm.
me. But without that resiliency, at first, it's like you have to know that the shame is only with you, and it's usually a lie. So you need to let it go.
Mhm.
And with that, is there a strategy plan? Do you have like some checklist or something, or maybe some, overall generalities to use when a crisis comes? So let's say it's a financial crisis. Is there like a strategy plan to deal with, or like if it's a relationship crisis?
For strategies as far as crisis goes, I mean, I think it's like, so it all depends on what type and where you're at. Sometimes people, it's, you feel like the anxiety and the nervousness is just ramping up.
Mhm.
And so grounding yourself can be really important in bringing you in the here and now. And so, practicing breathing, take a deep breath in and exhale, and try to relax. Um, but as far as working through the crisis, I would say one thing is, again, turning to your support, your friends and your family. Use them as, where you can talk about things, talk it out, so that's one. And I already mentioned, counseling or volunteering is another. Some other things is definitely, create your tribe, but, information and resources. So sometimes we feel so alone in what we're going through, or we feel like nobody else has experienced what we're experiencing. And so it can be very isolating, and it can create just a spiral for us, either whether it's anxiety or depression or things of that nature. And so reach out and look at information and resources, because you might be surprised. Like you might think you're the only one going through a tough relationship or a breakup, and then you find out, no, it's not just me, and there's other people that have had these same feelings or similar feelings. And so that can somehow, that feels comforting to know that there's other people that has that have been in our shoes before. And so look at resources, look at what additional information's out there. I've talked to people that have gone through divorce, which is incredibly stressful, even under the
Mhm.
best of circumstances. And so they get, people get very overwhelmed very quickly. And so they're looking at what information's out there, like on co-parenting, and what
Mm.
information's out there, like legal information. And then also, just all kinds of things. So I would say put it in bite-sized pieces so you don't get overwhelmed.
I'd agree.
Try to prioritize, try to look at information and resources in smaller steps. So I guess to answer your question, I would say build your network, have
Hmm.
support. The second thing I would say is reach out, look at the information and resources, but do it in smaller steps so that you're not overwhelmed, and prioritize those. Um, and also, even though a lot of people talk about self-care plan, and when they hear that, they're just like, what? But I think
Hmm.
there's a lot of power in it. And I think a lot of people don't realize self-care plan could mean going in for medical appointments, going in for dental appointments, making sure that you're healthy physically. Mental health is definitely a piece of that, a part of that. So making those appointments if it's appropriate, if it's what you need. And then I think also having interest and having some fun.
Hmm.
So exploring things about who you are and what's good for you, and that can fill up your cup, and you can feel energized, and kind of it can help you move through that crisis a little bit easier.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And so let's get into our one of our last questions before we bring out the superhero tactics out to the realm. So a lot of people have a lot of emotions going through these situations. The average
Mhm.
human has 70,000 thoughts a day. Mind blow just on that alone.
Right.
And now we're going through a crisis. And probably these thoughts are going through people's heads. What attitude should I have in this season? Am I allowed to feel in this situation? Is there an appropriate response? When do I know to seek help?
Hmm.
Could we get some answers to those questions? Because those are probably just some of the racing thoughts that an average person in crisis has.
I think I think that anybody says, "Well, this is how you should feel," or "This is what you should think." When people start going down that route, I get very shy or reserved when I hear things like that, because
Hmm.
I don't think there's any right or wrong way of how you should feel.
Hmm.
So I think it's you as an individual have the right to feel the way you feel and what you're thinking.
Hmm.
Um, so I would start there, is like, how does a person, where are they at right now?
Hmm.
And looking at what they need, what is helpful, and start brainstorming what can assist them through that moment. Because, I might see something, and again, it might seem really intense, and to you, it might be like, oh, that's nothing, Heather.
We've
Um,
had those conversations before,
yeah.
especially in
And
the IT
so,
realm on your computer. Yeah.
yeah. So, so I think it's what the person, what they're feeling, what they need, and going from there as a starting point.
Hmm. So that last part is, when do they know to seek help? I mean, when does a person know it's like it's gone too far? Like, is there like a time frame? Or is there like certain symptoms that I should be going through and be like, oh, I should seek help?
If you are feeling like there's no hope,
Hmm.
um, and you're feeling disconnected, those are some warning signs. If you feel, so I would say that that's definitely one. Hopelessness, lack of belonging is definitely a warning sign.
Hmm.
If you're finding that your normal thoughts and behaviors are not the same as they were, if you're having difficulty functioning in your everyday life,
Hmm.
so maybe that is, my sleep patterns all off. And I've things that are out of the ordinary for you. So I would say, if you're having difficulties functioning at work, at home, those
Hmm.
are also red flags that, maybe to reach out. And then, of course, if you're um having thoughts where you're just incredibly, it's like, I've never felt this sad, but I can't
Hmm.
stop crying, or I'm so angry. That's also a form, could be a form when people are angry. It could be just like they're angry.
Hmm.
Sometimes that irritability can be a form of an expressed depression. So it just all depends on what's happening, and what's happening with that person. But I think anything that is different for you, reach out. It can't hurt. It can only make things better.
That's awesome. let's go jump into the last thing that we ask every superhero that comes in our show is 3 superhero tactics. So Heather, I want you to visit back about 24, 25 years ago. We'll never admit age on the show, whoever how old you are.
Right.
and and then or visiting like a person that you mentored. What is the 3 tactics that you give them to help them thrive in a crisis?
Okay, well, there's 2 before that. I would have to say there's 2 before that. One is
Yeah.
commitment.
Mm-hmm.
So honestly, what got me through going through some hard times is my children. Like my commitment to family is huge.
Mm-hmm.
So because I'm so committed to my family, like that helped. That was like a precursor. And then, but I would say purpose. To get you through a crisis is, your purpose, your passion. If you're like, I don't know what my purpose or my passion is, it's like, well, then that's kind of a nice adventure to go on. So
Mm-hmm.
those are 2 precursors I would have is commitment and also sense of purpose. Um, but I would say to get through a crisis, I would say one is information and resources.
Mm-hmm.
Um, prioritize those. And then the second thing, not in this order, but the second thing I would say is your tribe, people that you can turn to. Um, as far as a third thing, even though it's played out so many times, the self-care plan, I
Mm-hmm.
think really taking care of yourself and being kind to yourself and not beating yourself up, like, oh, I couldn't do this, or I'm just a screw up, or like really being kind to yourself and forgiving a little bit more, and just being okay with taking care of yourself, whether it's having a cup of coffee in the morning and enjoying that cup of coffee. I don't know. Whatever it is that gives you some, you know, it could be anything. Sorry
Mm-hmm.
about. So I don't know if that makes sense to anybody, but self care can look, like I said, it can be doctor's appointments, it could be counseling, it can
Mm-hmm.
also be finding interests that you like, and taking time out for that. It could be little moments where you're, like I said, enjoying a cup of coffee or watching a movie or something like that. But something that's filling you up, giving you energy.
Yeah. I know a person, he does a YouTube page. It's Awaken with JP, as the long hair with the beard, and he's really goofy and stuff like that. He says one of those things is like try to innovate our creativity back, especially during this season. And if you're in a crisis, take that moment to be creative. Maybe you're drawing a picture, maybe you're painting, maybe doing color by number or whatever you're doing to go over and to bring that creativity back, which then brings back that joy. So even amidst a crisis, you go
Mhm.
over and something might come out of it. So I
I've I've
wanted,
tried I've tried different things. I've tried like different interests or hobbies because I didn't really know, which sounds kind of silly, but I tried trapeze, believe it or not.
mhm.
Decided I did not like that.
Yeah,
But I
it
found
kind of can
other,
fall off.
yeah, so I found other things that were fun.
Yeah, one of the things I think you did for self care a few years back was Dancing with the Stars, local, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, so ballroom dancing, it turns out I loved it. And I did competitions and I did one just this past January and came in first place at the bronze level for East Coast Swing, Cha Cha, some of those rhythm dances. And it was just so much fun and the people were great. And I just tried it and it was like the best experience. And there's so many other things too. Tennis, sailing, just give it a try and see if you like it. For some people, they love skiing, whatever it might be for you.
And that's really awesome. So I wanted to thank you, Heather, for being on our show.
You.
Again, this is the first level of the show, folks. So if you guys are listening and on watching on the replay, we do a show called War Hero to Superhero. We up the level on digital TV, and each of our guests get a chance to be on our show. And how does Heather go get on our show? The most amount of views. So she has 72 hours from now to go over and get the most amount of views. And you can help. 3 seconds on Facebook, YouTube, Periscope, on my page is a view. That's it. Yes, you could watch all 29 minutes and 55 seconds, which as we're taping right now, but it only takes 3 seconds to go get Heather elevated. So if you want Heather to go to the next level, to go on our show, War Hero to Superhero, as a guest, to be broadcasted in the world, and you thought this was like the bomb diggity information, go over and just give 3 seconds. And I heard, Heather, that you might be wrestling with a podcast idea. Have you rationed that out yet?
So I'm looking at the podcast, and so there'll be more information on that, a little bit later. But yes, I'm looking at a podcast.
Yeah, I say talk it out. That's just my idea for the name of the show, but that's just me. So I might just have a little weight, a little clout in there, but that would be awesome. But yeah, so thank you for joining, and thank you guys for jumping in. We had at least one comment before we went out. Reggie, he's a command sergeant major out there. Now he's got his face mask on Facebook. He said, way to go, Heather. So he wanted to give you that kudos while you're out there. So
thank you.
Yep.
All right.
So
great pleasure. And thank you for listening to me and all that good stuff. And hopefully that'll help someone too.
Yep. Just tag like crazy to get it out there. That's all.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. You all have a good day.
Bye.